I changed accent.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you, comrades, for welcome to the second session of today. We'll have Marcel van Der Linden. He'll be speaking about Lenin and the current double crisis of capitalism and labor. A long view. Marcel will be speaking for about an hour, and of course we value debate, so after that we'll give the floor to speakers to contribute. Well, Marcel, over to you.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again with you. The last time I had the opportunity to do so was 8 years ago already. On that occasion, I spoke, amongst other things, about the problems facing the global labor movement. The text was later published in Weekly Worker. Unfortunately, all these things can be downloaded until today. Now, I would like to reflect further on that global crisis facing the labor movement, but this time from a slightly different perspective. To that, I want to go back to the beginning of the last century. World War I was, as we all know, a turning point in many ways. At the time, the idea of the general crisis of capitalism arose, which since then at times played a very large role in socialist thought. And in what follows, I want to bring together the discussion of this, the general crisis, with an analysis of the worldwide workers' movements. My central thought is that in the first decades after 1914, capitalism indeed went through a deep crisis, while labor movements gained actually strength. From the 1950s onward, the crisis of capitalism seems to be over, and the labor movement seemed to become even stronger. In recent decades, however, we see a return of capitalist crisis, but this time it is accompanied by a second deep international crisis, that of the labor movements. During and after World War I, the economic analysis of the revolutionary left changed. This was very clear with Lenin, for instance, who, building on the work of Nikolai Bukharin, Rudolf Hilferding, and John Hobson, saw an extensive and probably irreversible decline of world capitalism. The rapidly increasing power of the monopolies since the 1880s began, in his view, to culminate in a new stage of development named imperialism. Monopolistic competition leads to incessant global expansion of commodity production and competition and results in an intensified struggle for raw materials and sales areas. You all know this. But monopolist tendencies simultaneously engender, Lenin said, a tendency to stagnation. After all, as he said, as soon as monopoly prices are established, the economic possibility arises of deliberately retarding technical progress. And one of the consequences of this is that, as he said, the bourgeoisie, to an ever-increasing degree, lives on the proceeds of capital exports and by clipping coupons. Therefore, imperialism has to be characterized as parasitic or decaying capitalism. It's very interesting that we are now sitting in the Gulbenkian room, and if there ever was a coupon person, then it was Gulbenkian. Anyway, you know, he was known as Mr. 5%. However, Lenin warned against seeing this development as a homogeneous tendency. Imperialism, he says, does not and cannot transform capitalism from top to bottom. Imperialism complicates and sharpens the contradictions of capitalism, but it cannot do away with exchange, the market, competition, crises, etc. Next slide. Dag, moet ik dat doen?
The comrade here will have to do it.
Oh, it's a long distance. Great. Hey, this is strange. Is this slide too?
This is slide 2.
Yeah, you see, you are too fast. So Lenin says imperialism is moribund. Capitalism. This is also on slide 2. That's it.
If you tell the comrade when you want the next slide, then you can do it.
Comrade, I will tell you. Good. So, imperialism, he says, is moribund capitalism. Capitalism which is dying, but not yet dead. The essential feature of imperialism, by and large, is not monopolies pure and simple, but monopolies in conjunction with exchange, markets, competition, and crises. On the other hand, he says, the tendency to decay does not preclude the rapid growth of capitalism. And this is very important, of course. In the epoch of imperialism, capitalism is growing far more rapidly than before. But this growth is uneven, and he says it manifests itself in particular in the decay of the countries which are the richest in capital, and here he says between brackets, Britain. Remember that. In a letter to American workers in 1918, Lenin said, "The corpse of bourgeois society cannot be nailed in a coffin and buried. The corpse of capitalism is decaying and disintegrating in our midst, polluting the air and poisoning our lives, and meshing that is new, fresh, young, and virile." Yeah, that's the language of the day. Of threads and bonds of that which is old, moribund, and decaying. With this analysis, Lenin initiated the debate on the general crisis of capitalism that was to dominate left-wing thinking on the development of capitalism for decades. A debate to which he, of course, could contribute little further due to his death in 1924. Next slide, please. As early as 1922, Jenő, or Eugen Varga, who later would become Stalin's chief economist, published his book, The Period of Capitalist Decline. And in the years that followed, numerous contributions followed by which the theme that Lenin had started was further developed by Marxists of various persuasions. In 1930, the Polish Marxist Henryk Grossman published his influential study on the law of accumulation and breakdown of capitalism. And a few years later, Leon Trotsky spoke in his transitional program of the death throes of capitalism. It should be noted that not only Marxists thought that capitalism was dying, but many others as well. The conservative British-Russian historian Michael Postan wrote in 1935 in the prestigious journal, the Economic History Review, that the socialists' doubts about the viability of capitalism were increasingly shared by others. I quote, "Nowadays, the loudest lamentations at the deficient working of the system come from its most ardent defenders. The difference between them and the anti-capitalists is largely confined to the question of origins. But however much they differ about the origin and the causation, they all agree about the reality of the disease and its symptoms." And shortly after the end of the Second World War, the liberal economist Joseph Schumpeter said that there was a tendency towards decomposition of capitalist society that would inevitably lead to its dissolution. Well, according to the Marxist tradition, it is taken for granted that all modes of production and social formations have a beginning and an end. That is also why capitalism does not have an eternal life, of course. But how will capitalism find its Waterloo? Here it may make sense to return to Marx for himself for a moment. Marx worked with two different theoretical approaches that Stefan Breuer, a well-known scholar in Germany, who based himself on the older Hegel interpretation, calls esoteric and exoteric argumentations. The esoteric Marx emphasized that capitalism is undermining itself. As he wrote, I quote, "The true barrier to capitalist production is capital itself." You know this from Capital. With respect to the precise nature of this impediment, Marx had different ideas. In the Grundrisse, he put forward the following thesis, I quote, "As soon as labor in the direct form has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth," so for instance, by AI and whatever, "the surplus labor of the mass has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, just as the non-labor of the few for the development of the general powers of the human head. With that, production based on exchange value breaks down, and the direct material production is stripped of the form of penury and antithesis." That was one point. So capitalism destroys itself. In a letter to Engels that dates from approximately the same period, Marx asserted, however, a very different thing. He said, The proper task of bourgeois society is the creation of the world market, at least in outline, and of the production based on that market. Since the world is round, the colonization of California and Australia and the opening up of China and Japan would seem to have completed this process. Hence, on the European continent, revolution is imminent and will, moreover, instantly assume a socialist character. That's esoteric Marx. The exoteric Marx, on the other hand, considered the proletariat as the class whose historic task involved the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production and the final abolition of all classes. Marx sought to depict both approaches in a logical context. And as the labor movement began to flourish during his lifetime, this became more plausible. Next slide, please. So the double Marx was a product of his day. You see a short summary. On the one hand, he focused on the incipient and promising workers' movements. On the other hand, he performed an abstract analysis of the emerging commodity economy's objective boundaries. The essential assumption that led to the combination of the exoteric and the esoteric perspectives was the idea that the workers would never become more comfortable with the alienated universe of the generalized commodity economy. Now, let's return to 1914 and so. During the revolutionary wave that washed over the world between 1916 and 21, the socialist movements also did not feel they had to choose between the two perspectives. Precisely during the years when imperialism emerged, the labor movement also began to gain considerable strength, a development that began in the then most advanced capitalist countries, as is clearly evident, for example, in the growth of the trade union movement in that part of the world. Slide, please. So here you see the union. It's hard to see probably, but it summarizes union membership as percentage of the labor force in a number of advanced capitalist countries, beginning with Australia, ending with the United States. In every country you see a dramatic growth, beginning in Australia in 1905 with 10% and finishing in 1950 with 50%. In Britain we have from 11 to 40% and so on. So it's important to see that it is exactly during this period that the labor movement begins to gain enormous strength. Not, as many people seem to think, during the first industrial revolution. Not much happened on that scale. It happened with the second industrial revolution of the end of the 19th century. Comparable figures for other parts of the world I don't know, but it is evident that trade unions emerged there also at about the same time or slightly later. In China, for instance, in the 1920s, a vigorous labor movement emerged that ended in the Shanghai Massacre of 1927. In Japan, there was a vigorous labor movement during the interwar period, which, due to sharp repression, soon ended in total demise. After some earlier incitement, a heroic age, as it is called by historians, broke out in Africa from about 1935 onwards, with a number of great strikes with varying levels of union organization involved, for instance, in the Rhodesias, in French West Africa, the Gold Coast, Egypt. In large parts of Latin America, trade unions managed to consolidate during the 1920s and 40s as conservative elites tried to neutralize the undermining influence of the Russian Revolution and World War I. Precisely from the point of view of the general crisis of capitalism, the esoteric perspective of collapse and the exoteric perspective of the insurrectionary putsch seem to coincide more or less. Only in such a short historical period can a genuinely revolutionary organization achieve the allegiance of large masses whose struggle for immediate, indispensable interests also goes beyond the framework of the capitalist system. In the years that followed, however, in the 1920s, this changed. In the absence of an acutely revolutionary situation, revolutionaries are faced with the almost impractical task of walking a tightrope between two abysses: the right abyss of reformist opportunism and the left abyss of sectarianism. In the developed industrialized countries, the working masses are mostly reformist, as we know. Here they have far more to lose than their chains. They are built into a system which they seek to improve, insofar as they recognize themselves as a class or a part of a class. But this system they certainly do not want to destroy. If a communist party wants to gain their trust, it must legitimize itself as a successful champion of reform. In doing so, it all too easily becomes a mere part of the system it has set out to destroy. It becomes its left wing, which precisely by achieving improvements contributes to the preservation of the system. If, on the other hand, the party renounces a long and serious struggle for reforms, for compromises, for cooperation with other, by no means revolutionary parties and forces, and if it concentrates on trying to transcend the revolutionary reality, it will either become a sect that disguises its powerlessness with revolutionary phraseology, or, driven by impatience, it will fall into putschist adventures. We have many examples of that. Now, we should see that Lenin viewed the proletarian revolution from a double perspective, as is evidence in the Third Congress of the Comintern, for instance. When there was evidence of mass radicalism, as in Russia in the autumn of 1917, he opted for an immediate communist seizure of power. But when popular revolutionary ferment was on the decline, as in Europe in 1921-22, he adopted a more gradualist strategy in which piecemeal reforms became acceptable in the short run as the most expedient means of winning mass support. Now, even after World War II, the vast majority of Marxists initially remained convinced that the decline of capitalism would continue. For instance, the left-wing socialist Fritz Sternberg argued that the view as would the period of stagnation of the 1920s and 30s again be followed by a prolonged recovery, as had happened after 1870-1871, he thought that was nothing than a pseudo-construction of reformists and bourgeois economists. He called it a mixture of nonsense, platitudes, and premature generalizations. Until the end of the 1940s, Sternberg repeatedly emphasized that new crises were imminent and the decline of capitalism would prevail. In case you don't know, Sternberg, he unfortunately only published his books in German, so Tina and I, we can read it, but many people not. But he was also the one who was invited by Trotsky in 1933 to write the economic part of the transitional program, because Trotsky thought that he didn't know much of economics and Sternberg knew more about it. So, until the end of the 1940s, Sternberg repeatedly emphasized that new crises were imminent. Books with such titles as The Coming Crisis in 1947 and Living with Crisis in 1949 testify to this. Similarly, the German Communist Party and many other communist parties assumed as late as 1948 that the increased power of the Soviet Union, the emergence of other socialist countries, the crisis of the colonial system, and the contradictions within the capitalist camp had led to what they called an extraordinary deepening of the general crisis of world capitalism. Now, naturally, there were also Marxists who at that time already thought that the decline of capitalism did not have to be sustainable. They included, for instance, the supporters of Nikolai Kondratiev's theory of the long waves, such as the Dutch Kautsky Sam de Wolf and the German Social Democratic Klassenkampf group. Moreover, from the early 1940s onwards, there were Marxists who, impressed by the emerging war economy, thought that capitalism could begin to unfold a new dynamic. Initially, however, they remained relatively isolated. An important example is Edward Sard, about which Yasamin has published an article some years ago. Edward Sard, an American Trotskyist economist who already in early 1944, in a brilliant article, prophesied that an arms race would begin after the war. For this reason, the United States, he said, would permanently retain the character of a war economy. Even in times of peace, America's military spending would remain considerable, with, among other things, a drastic reduction in the percentage of unemployed compared to the 1930s as a result. You should keep in mind here that In the earlier days of capitalism, you had periods of peace in which there was no arms development, or not much, and only in times of beginning war, there would be really armament investment. And now he says there will be no peace without armaments industry. We will have armaments industry forever. And so the nature of capitalism is changed by that. But it will also lead to the disappearance of unemployment and so on. It took until the early 1950s before such theories were taken seriously in wider circles. The long post-war boom necessitated a reconsideration of the general capitalist crisis. However, this period that the French so eloquently call the glorious 30 years, la Trente Glorieuse, also heralded the beginning of the end of the traditional workers' movements. This first became visible in the 1940s or 1950s with the consumer cooperatives. Like all businesses under capitalism, they were increasingly forced to centralize and to concentrate capital due to improved transportation facilities and new retail forms, the rise of supermarkets and so on. This trend manifested itself partly in the declining number of cooperatives and in the increasing membership strength of cooperative units. Often the average age of members rose as elderly members remained loyal to their cooperatives and younger ones failed to materialize. But there's more, not just consumer cooperatives. Also, for instance, some workers' parties started already in the 1950s to decline. Next slide, please. Here you see the membership, the votes for the French Communist Party from 1924 to 2007. You see this decline begins at the end of the 1940s. So this has nothing to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union or so. And there are many or more of these communist parties who start to decline much earlier. The Communist Party in France stopped having its independent participation in elections after 2007. So then, from then on, they have alliances. So that's why the graph stops there. After the long boom ended, the decline of the unions and of the workers' parties began to become more general. In most countries with independent workers' organizations, union density, that is, union members as percentage of the total labor force, has been declining. On a global scale, union unity is now almost insignificant. I've already announced this in my talk 8 years ago. Independent trade unions organize now about 5% of their target group worldwide. And the majority of the members live in the relatively wealthy North Atlantic regions, Britain and so on. Can we have a next slide? Next slide, please.
It's not online. It's not online.
Because I have many more slides.
You've left the Zoom.
This is okay. You see the United. Oh, it was a good one here. We're looking for the United States. But you just had it.
It's the one kicked out of the Zoom meeting.
Can I ask people who are using Wi-Fi to switch off the doing this on the weekend as well?
It's probably not that issue.
It is, it shows.
I also have a USB stick with it.
No,
That will...
you can show yours is for Zoom. We can show it here.
So we're back.
It's back. Okay, there it is.
It goes to Zoom.
Good.
Okay.
So as an illustration, you see here the development of union density in the United States. It's a graph made by the Brookings Institution, Democratic Party so not very socialist. And you see that it has a mountainous structure, or as French political scientists say, a parabolic structure. It sounds much more interesting. Anyway, so what you see is it starts low, and then it increases to a high point somewhere in the 1950s, and then it starts to decline again. And there's indication of some moments, important, the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, and in 81 you remember that perhaps when Reagan fired the air traffic controls. So, but we can make graphs like this for many trade unions, trade union densities. Labor, social democratic and communist parties, which were especially strong in advanced capitalist countries, with the exception of Brazil, of course, are not doing very well electorally either, as we all know. Of the 18 most important social democratic parties in the world, 14 reached their apex before 1990. Brazil, France, and Portugal were a bit later, in the early 21st century, and there was one exception, Canada. So I already was worrying about my theory. But then in 2011 it peaked and then fell back again. So now I'm at peace. Yeah, maybe we can move on to the next slide. Then there's a slide missing. Okay, good. That's not your fault, that's my stupidity. Here you see that also in other countries, the communist parties are in trouble. This is the Communist Party Marxist in West Bengal, which was, of course, a late starter in the 1960s. It began to participate in the elections after a split of the party, and so I don't go into details here. But so you see that they did very well with percentages of 35 and more. And then suddenly, in 2006, they went down. What happened? They had become neoliberal and started to really aggressive anti-peasant actions, so that peasants were removed, so that certain industries could be established there, and so on. And this was led to a lot of protest. And so you see that they are at the end of their tether almost. So all in all, when it comes to the labor movement, we see three things. On a world scale, consumer cooperatives have either not been doing well, or they have morphed into retail industries without memberships, democratic controlling the business. This started once very clearly in Sweden in the 1980s, 70s even. You had wildcat strikes of the personnel of KF, that's the huge consumer Förbundet in Sweden. Which is strange for a workers' organization. Inside the workers' organization, you have wildcat strikes. And unions, of course, did not support these strikes because they were allies of the management of the cooperatives. Or what you see is many cases is that the consumer cooperatives have been changed into ordinary capitalist firms, as for instance in the Netherlands and in Germany also. But we can say that the consumer cooperatives are mostly finished, although nowadays we see the rise again of small consumer cooperatives. I'll come back to that. Trade unions are not only a weak force, but their power is also decreasing. And thirdly, in many countries, trade unions have lost their allies, the workers' parties. Either because these parties have disappeared, as many communist parties have done, or because they have adopted a variant of neoliberalism. So as a consequence, NGOs, so non-governmental organizations, have partly shouldered activities that traditionally would have been the responsibility of the international trade union movement. So, for instance, much of the struggle to regulate and abolish child labor is now carried on out by NGOs and not by the labor movement anymore. The downturn of the old labor movements, I would say, is almost all-embracing. But don't get depressed. At the same time, global capitalism is also in trouble, as we know. Since the beginning of the Great Recession of 2008, awareness has generally taken hold that the years of rapid economic growth are over. In 2016, the famous American journal Foreign Affairs devoted an entire issue to the question how to survive slow economic growth. That was the title of the issue. Even earlier, a report published by the OECD argued that the growth expectations for the coming decades appeared to be rather mediocre. While growth continued more in emerging economies, they said, than in the OECD, it would be slowed by gradual exhaustion in the race to catch up and the less favorable demographics on all other countries. So, in the end, it would all go down. Moreover, influential authors agree that capitalism has lost its momentum or even reached its final phase. Wolfgang Streeck, for instance, with his articles in the New Left Review, or what's this case? The British journalist, End of Capitalism. No, anyway, there's a number of. I should have made a note here. Sorry. So, surveying the period since Lenin wrote his book Imperialism, the Highest Stage, it seems that the thesis contained in Lenin's work has become curiously inverted by the reality of the inverted by the reality of the last century. To see that, we must first of all note that the period between the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the crisis of 1974 was historically extraordinary. The entire period from 1929 until the 1970s constitutes a significant divergence from the trends unleashed by the industrial and transportation revolution of the 19th century. The post-1970s period returned the world to 19th century trends and their associated financial turbulence, culminating in the 2007-2009 economic crisis. The changes of 1929 to 1974 obviously also had a prelude and an after effect, so that the periodization is not that strict as these years suggest. Now, what made this time from the 1930s to 1970s so special? Interpretations vary widely, but historians generally point out that capitalism in the North Atlantic underwent a number of important changes in the early 20th century. There are many theories about this. The First World War is often mentioned as a turning point. In West Germany, the social democratic theory of organized capitalism, which Rudolf Hilferding had developed from 1915, had a certain influence. According to this view, there would have been a growing penetration of the economy and the state with the development of cartels and trusts and the replacement of free competition with planned production. In communist circles, the theory of state monopoly capitalism has long been in vogue. In fact, I don't know what this is in Britain, but in France, for instance, certainly was. It was based on Lenin's thesis that the First World War had transformed laissez-faire capitalism in close cooperation with the state into a capitalism dominated by big companies. Still other authors saw the rise of Fordism as the crucial phenomenon. That is, a form of capitalism in which corporate profits and workers' wages are positively fed back. So the profits of the employers go partly to the workers, so they can buy more things, and these can be then produced by, and so on. Finally, there are the authors who saw corporatism as the most important characteristic of the new situation. Now, I cannot evaluate all these theories here, but they agree that in the early decades of the last century, there have been major changes in the structure of advanced capitalism. after about half a century, it became clear that the new form of capitalism was coming to an end. One spoke of the crisis of Fordism or the end of organized capitalism. These are titles of books. So it seems that the general crisis that Lenin spoke about in 1916 was interrupted for half a century. But in the meantime, the balance of power between capital and labor changed dramatically. Around 1916 to 21, the inevitable decline of capitalism seemed to have begun, while workers' movements grew significantly in strength and revolutionary possibilities increased. From the 1980s onwards, the decline of capitalism is beginning to take hold again, but this time the workers' movements have weakened and the revolutionary possibilities seem slim for the time being. Perhaps you disagree. We now face a double crisis, I would say, not only the crisis of capitalism, but also of the workers' movements. In any case, I think that Lenin's theory of the general crisis must be re-examined. Lenin would certainly have had no problem with that. He never hesitated to modify his positions whenever he deemed it necessary. Between 1893 and 1924, he changed his theoretical thoughts on the agrarian question, the tactic of the proletarian party, the state and the dictatorship of the proletariat in capitalist underdeveloped countries. And I'm sure that if he were alive today, he would also have reconsidered the theory of the general crisis. It is now, I think, up to us to reanalyze socialist perspectives on a global scale. Now, the crisis of the labor movements is particularly worrisome, of course, because there is still a very great need among working people for effective economic and political advocacy, especially at a time of capitalist decline. In these circumstances, what are the prospects for workers' movements? In the long run, things may not be as gloomy as they seem today. A number of factors can change, thus enabling a more optimistic future. First, you will agree with me that class conflicts will not diminish, and workers all over the world will continue to feel the ever-present need for effective organizations and forms of struggle. Let me illustrate this with a few things. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics reported a 13% rise in work stoppages in 2025. Can you change to... Here you see places where strikes are taking place, and the strikes have been increasing in the United States during the last few years. And if I now move to the next slide, then we see here the protest turnouts in the US. And despite Trump, there's a lot of protest in the United States. In China, we seem to be witnessing a revival of strike actions as well. Can we see the next slide? Yes. This is a graph which I've based on the work of the China Labor Bulletin. This was a publication in Hong Kong, and they counted the strikes in China, mainland China. And you see that they signaled a high point in 2015, then it goes down, but then they see another increase since 2023. Unfortunately, the graph could not be continued because the bulletin has been dissolved. You can guess why. Second, we should not forget that the global labor force is larger and more interconnected than ever before. The number of employees, as the ILO, the International Labour Organization, calls them, the wage earners, the number of employees worldwide increased from 2.3 billion in 1991 to 3.8 billion in 2025. So an increase of about 1.5 billion people. So more and more workers. Third, there are also explicit signs of a renewal. In many countries, trade unions are trying to open up to informal and illegal workers. Illegal workers and informal workers are now numbered at about, nobody knows exactly because they are illegal, but about 1.2 billion people. So this is an important target group for trade unions, but trade unions usually are not really interested in these people because they cannot do collective agreements and that kind of thing, and so they neglect them. But things are changing. For instance, in Uganda, you have the Amalgamated Transport and General Workers Union, which a number of years ago had 3,000 members, so they were only the formally organized transport workers, drivers of trucks and so. But now they have opened up to informal workers. And now they have 100,000 members. So an enormous increase. A study by the International Transport Workers Federation shows that new types of workers' organizations have emerged in many places. I quote, "Local worker associations are organizing themselves into city, national, and international organizations. There are many examples, such as the 400 organizations of street vendors in India making up the National Alliance of Street Vendors of India, NASFI, and vendors, marketeers, and cross-border trader organizations from different regions in Zambia that form ASEAN. These and over 20 other organizations of street and market vendors are affiliated to the growing international alliance StreetNet. StreetNet is a democratically structured international organization of street and market vendors and hawkers with a strong focus on the representation of women in its structures. It's also remarkable that in many places in the world we see a reinvention of forms of organization that played a major role in the early classical labor movements. I think, for instance, of the mutual aid funds, or in Britain they are known as friendly societies. That's a form of mutual insurance against illness or unemployment, a form of self-protection that dates back to the 18th century at the latest, but is now being reintroduced by precarious and informal workers. Also noteworthy are the housing cooperatives and the small consumer cooperatives like the Solidarity Purchase Groups, which have since 1990 seen the light of day in several countries. But we can also think of new types of cooperatives that build on older models, for example, energy production cooperatives that work with different energy sources such as photovoltaics, wind or biogas, or energy consumption cooperatives which pursue the goal of supplying their members with energy which they buy as cheaply and sustainably as possible from different suppliers and then distribute it further. So, you see, despite the decline of the formal labor movement, we see the revival on a lower level. So let me conclude. We are confronted with two crises, the crisis of capitalism and the crisis of workers' movement. The dictionary defines a crisis as the turning point of a disease when an important change takes place, indicating either recovery or death. So this is what the doctor says, this patient is in crisis, it means he may die or he may regain his or her strength. Nobody can be certain that capitalism will once more revive, but neither is it impossible that the workers' movements regain their vitality, and these would obviously have direct consequences for the development of capitalism. Oh, we go on, more? That's it.
Thank you. Marcel will now be opening the floor for contributions. Please raise your hand if you want to speak. Make sure you face the camera or the audience so the microphone can pick you up and people can see you.
You can see us.
I see myself here.
Yeah, but
And Chris.
when the speakers come,
Okay, good.
Okay.
Well, Tina had, I think, go first.
Tina
You go, Tina.
Tina was first.
Sure.
Ina was right.
Thank you so much for fighting my corners. Okay, that was very interesting, Marcel. Thank you. the slides, the way you presented the changes in capitalism grew, and then you had a special period where it sort of was a little bit in trouble, but also the workers, not in trouble, sorry, it was booming more, wasn't it? And then also the workers' movements were in that period booming. You identify that as between the sort of 1930s and 1970s. I mean, you know, how do you see, I mean, you said the decline of the workers' movement then wasn't related to the end of the Soviet Union because it started before, etc. But that period does seem to have some linkage with the existence of the Soviet Union, presumably. How do you see it? You know, obviously we're not Stalinists, we don't believe the Soviet Union was a workers' state where the workers were in charge, or socialism. You know, it changed pretty quickly after 1921, it certainly turned into its opposite, but it's the pure existence of a alternative to capitalism sort of certainly caused capitalism to react, caused capitalism to adjust how it operated. And that included buying off the working class, for example, to hold off other countries following suit. You know, certainly the German post-war boom after the Second World War, when after the First World War, obviously they tried the opposite, deindustrializing it, and that led to the opposite effect of you know, making the working class very strong, but also making the fascists very strong. But after the Second World War, the attempt to buy off the working class to stop it becoming socialist. You know, and that also probably, you know, led to the union movement getting stronger, the communist parties becoming stronger, etc. So how do you envisage, or how do you explain, you know, the existence of the Soviet Union? Although we're clearly saying that it wasn't a socialist state, it certainly forced something onto capitalism. And related to that, we see today a lot of parties, still trained socialists, trying to appeal to that period, you know, the 1970s or even the 50s, the Keynesianism, the idea that, you know, you can ask the state to go back to that, you know, increased welfare, spending, etc. in capitalism today is not under any pressure to do it, unlike when the Soviet Union was still in existence and that pressure was there. So that is the, you know, it's a tactic, or it's an appeal to capitalism, which it has no interest, it has no, you know, there's no necessity for it to introduce all of that. That's certainly the dead end. In terms of not being so gloomy, and, you know, that's well, the eternal optimist, we're always hoping for the best. And, you know, it's certainly good, strikes are picking up, and there's some strikes in China, but you don't hear much about it, you know, because it's not a very democratic society. There's a protest in the US, that's all good. But, you know, the big but, I guess, is that unless this is cohered into political party, you know, it's very unlikely these challenges will be able to cohere the working class into anything that can launch a challenge to the system. So, you know, in your view, do you think, you know, I mean, trade unions per definition, they have to, you know, they're not anti-capitalist, are they? They are part and parcel of the capitalist system. Of course, we work in trade unions, and we ask, you know, all communists and socialists to engage in the trade unions to win people over, to talk to them about the need to go beyond, you know, to talk about the need to, you know, that having a trade union is not, or strike days or protests here and anti-racist campaigns there, that's all really good, but unless we as communists can revive the idea that actually we need to get organized in parties, you know, in our countries and beyond, of course, we have to have an international outlook. These strikes, these union memberships, you know, and organizing the unorganized proletariat, that's all very good, but it's not going to be enough to overthrow that system. So we are, objectively, capitalism is rife to be overthrown, as you outlined, but subjectively, I think unless we can can get across again and, sort of clean communism from the stage of the Soviet Union and reclaim it as a democratic, human liberation, that it requires a communist future for human liberation, including the climate catastrophe, to deal with that. It's unlikely that those protests will be able to do it by themselves, in our view. So I'd be interested to hear your view on that. I think your attitude toward communist parties might be a little bit more critical than ours. How the working class has to be organized to make use of how it can overthrow capitalism. Thank you.
Niet praten, hè? Marcus.
Hello, Marcus from Australia. And you mentioned you're pleased that the Canadian Labor Party declined to fit your thesis. The country I'm in, the Labor Party's in government and has been for a while. It's still leading in the polls. It's dropped a bit, but it will almost definitely win the next election. It's a very corporatised right-wing Labor Party. Maybe it's an outline. I'm glad Tina raised the question of the USSR and the impact in the long boom, as we call it in English. So I think in that sense. Peggy Noonan was a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. She's got a column in the Wall Street Journal today or yesterday, where she says socialism in the United States is not a passing phase. It's here and they're really mean and horrible. They're not like your grandpa in the IWW who wanted to make America really good. They're mean and nasty and hate America. And she doesn't say it, but I think is the sort of part of that. So I think that shows that with the decline of the formal trade union movement, I've sort of come up with this idea that this gives us an opportunity. One of the weaknesses of, particularly in Britain and Australia and Labor Party type countries, Canada to a certain extent, New Zealand, is that the political parties were made by the trade unions, and that made them politically quite weak in many ways, and to the right, whereas the continent of Europe, particularly the German example, the unions were made by the party. And I'm wondering if we now have an opportunity to remake unions from reborn parties that we don't yet have either. But I mean, and that could actually improve the culture of the trade unions and make them less labourite in that sense. Your graph of the PCF decline, I mean, the points where it happened. One was the rise of the Cold War, 1949 to 51, the Iron Curtain, bang. That would have had an immediate political impact. And if you look at the vote results of communist parties in Western countries around the world, including from Australia to France, I mean, France was up here and Australia was down there in terms of how communist parties went. A similar trajectory. It was the impact of the Cold War, then the impact of Hungary and the 20th century, the 20th Congress speech, and then Czechoslovakia. And you could see those points in that graph as well. So I don't know if it was just sort of an internal economic labour movement, the puncture points also from politics. I was actually on strike for 2 hours today. You didn't notice it, but this is one of the unions I'm a member of, the National Tertiary Education Union, and I was national president of a union for 5 years in Australia, the Journalists Union. And what we did in that period was we went from organising in basically 3 big factories, 3 big employers, to recognising that we need to employ work and develop gig workers. So 80 to 90% of our members had 3 employers, and now that's gone. And now the shift to try and organise what we call gig workers, I think it's called the precariat elsewhere.
We call it that.
Okay, gig work, yeah. So that is also going on. But the trade unions are completely corporatised in Australia, as they are, I would say, everywhere. They're enmeshed with the state and the way the state operates. Trade union membership in Australia is at an all-time, you know, it was 50% in 1950. It's about 13% at the moment. There was a bit of a blip up, and the unions were congratulating themselves on it, but that was because there's a Labor government which has expanded the public service, which tends to be more unionised. Actually, private sector unionisation in Australia has actually continued to decline. It's down at about 8%. And one of the questions I have for you is, one of the biggest unions in Australia is called the Shoppies, the Shop Distributive and Allied Employees Union, the supermarket workers and so on. And it's dominated by right-wing Catholic Laborites. You know, they oppose gay marriage, etc., etc., etc. And there's been a breakaway union called RAFWU. It's only got a few hundred or 1,000 members, and it's organised in a few points. My tendency is to oppose breakaway red unions in that sense, and to build counterpoints within the existing unions, as corporatized as they are, as hollowed out as they are, as tied in with the state as they are. I'd like to hear what you think on that. So we also have a massive superannuation system in Australia, and we have some people who regard it as workers' capital, because on the committees of these massive funds, they've been trillions of dollars worth of money. 50% are reserved for workers' representatives, and their union representatives are completely enmeshed.
Only 50%.
Yes.
Trillion.
Yes, but what you were talking about with the cooperatives, they, in order to be sustained, they keep merging and merging and merging and merging. I mean, if I look at my superannuation fund, it's had to merge a number of times in order to remain relevant. So they're not immune from those. But I thought it was very useful. I'm probably still not as optimistic yet as you sounded, but I'm glad some of us are.
Good. Come to the other side.
Hello, I'm Rick. Hello, I've got an impediment in right folk. I've got right a disability, so please bear with me. I just want to begin right in the 80s. I was at university back in the 83 time, and I was in Sheffield. And I remember supporting the miners at the time and going to Oak Creek, going to the miners' villages. And we had a university group at university where we went and supported the miners. And if you think about the miners and the talk at the time, Thatcherism at the time, the whole agenda back in the 80s was attacking the miners as the vanguard of the union movement, and it went all out. I remember going to Sheffield just before the attacking Orgreave, and going to the Sheffield Wednesday football club, and we were going back from a protest, anti-racist protests, and it was at night, and we saw hundreds and hundreds of the police vans there. There must have been about 300, and I remember. I remember at the time that there was a whole concerted attack. So I agree with the point that I agree. So I agree with the issue at the time that the union movement were going down, but there was also a concerted attack because of the government in Europe who attacked the union members. They introduced massive anti-union laws all over the place in terms of voting, in terms of what we did. And after university, I remember being I work in children's services in the council, and I'm a social worker. And I began involved with NALGO at the time. And I remember that so what's happening NALGO merged with NUPI, with NALGO, NUPI, COSE. And it's began to develop the black workers groups, disability groups, all these groups and all these different sections, and all the effort at the time all started to be into that. And we have black right workers at conferences, we have disability right conferences, but the right analysis we needed at the time in terms of the changing nature of capitalism, the right end of the Soviet Union, what happened at that time. My dad was like a foundry worker. He was illiterate. He couldn't read and write. He used to get to work 3 in the morning. But I remember he told me at his workplace they made metal holes for industry. He told me he was a member of the TGWU, and he said there was 100% membership there. There's all part of the Indian Workers Association. I don't know if people know what they are, Indian workers. So they were all members of that. They were all members of unions. There's 100% membership. And so clearly, I remember as well that the the West Midlands, they closed down all the industry, completely closed in the mid-80s. It all moved to Czechoslovakia, went to Hong Kong, went to East Asia. And so we've seen this complete, I think over the past 40 years, haven't we? We've seen a complete atomization of manufacturing. And unions, I don't think, have really moved with the times. You know, we spend our time talking about holidays, about the retirement. We don't speak about the pension. They have raffles about things, and they have other things. But we don't. I mean, at the moment in unison, we've got a ballot for a pie, and we sent it out, and we were ringing around all the members. I mean, asking them to vote. And people were saying, well, can't afford it. You know, the cleaners were saying, we aren't able to go out and strike. People have to do stuff. So we've not really, I think, over the past 40 years, in terms of how we've organised in unions, moved with the present times. We need to completely break it up completely. We need to change the contribution to pay. It should be a quid. We shouldn't be asking people to pay £18 or £90 or whatever it is. It's ask people to pay minimum membership. All these different groups that exist in unions, I think the disability group, the black workers groups, all these different types of groups that exist. We should return to basics, go back to basics, and the whole bureaucracy that exists is just a complete nonsense. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Then I have Jack.
Yeah, Jack Conrad, really interesting talk, great graphs, great graphics. And I like the 2 pictures at the end, particularly the Chinese one.
Yeah.
I think the last time you were mentioning Paul Mason,
Yeah.
complete sellout now.
Yeah.
But last time I actually spoke to him was in the second-hand department down the road where whichever direction we are. Nissan Pancras, Houseman's.
Yeah.
Anyway, he just got back from China. I think he was on BBC Two or one of these news programs. And he said it reminded him, in terms of either from history books or parents, in terms of the strikes, there were so many of them, right, that they don't make it to the statistic books. So, you know, again, I don't know whether that's true now, but I think that, okay, if you're in Hong Kong, presumably either getting messages from people who are on strike, or you're looking at local papers, or whatever, I don't know. All I'm saying is that when you've got a dynamic economy, as you did have, and maybe I'm not sure whether you still have, but you certainly did, workers could gain concessions extremely quickly. You know, so again, I'm boring, comrades, I know, but in the 1960s, there was a comedy program on TV. I know you've heard it, called The Rag Trade, but that was true. I knew someone in my hometown called the bell ringer of Ford's. And the reason why he was the bell ringer of Ford's is over his machine, he had an old-fashioned bell, and once a day, once every other day, it'd ring the bell, the guys would come out, and like mainly guys, right? The management would concede. Did that make it to the statistic books? So I'm just saying, in other words, if you take China, and where capital, or whatever you want to call it, I'd call it capitalism. I'm not saying China is capitalist, but where capitalism is dynamic, clearly the working class can gain strength, right? And I just fear, you know, that in terms of the description that you've got, it was well illustrated, you know, that capitalism is in crisis. That's great if the working class is strong, but capitalism, right, going into stagnation, going into slump when the working class is weak, is fatal. And I do think that, you know, you do have conversations with some comrades on the left, and they've heard what's Michael Roberts, the next slump, which it will come, right? But I mean, if it happens tomorrow, that's not going to be good for our movement. And I just wanted to make the point, at least in terms of my understanding of communism and what distinguished it from, you know, Marx's communism compared with other communisms, is that communism is an objective movement in capitalist society. And it precisely is the sort of original description that you talked about Marx's esoteric and exoteric. That makes perfect sense. That's great. So if capitalism is, you know, how should I put it, dominant, it's spreading around the world, it's employing more workers, and the workers' parties and the trade unions and the cooperatives are getting stronger, then the working class is ready, as capitalism goes into crisis, we take over, right? But what about now? And so what I'm not convinced by, I'm glad that you're an optimist, and I'm an optimist, because I think you have to be an optimist. And, you know, what else are we meant to do? I mean, sort of dig a hole in the ground, prepare for the doom. We've got to look for positive features. The problem I've got, I think, along with Tina, is that your sprouts of hope, you know, pretty bloody small. They don't convince me that the good times are just around the corner. That's all I'm saying. And I would just put forward this, Marcel, and I think we had this discussion last time you were here, and as you said, it was ages ago. There is another route that Tina sort of alluded to, and that is, yes, we need trade unions. We need strong trade unions. We need a confident working class. We need an organized working class. But precisely, why can't it come from a political party? And I'm thinking back, you know, to the Chartist movement in Britain, and I know it had a complex relationship to trade unions, and it didn't organize workers in giant workplaces, right? Chartist. So I'm looking at the present working class in London and in Britain. It's increasingly atomized. Marcus mentioned gig workers, the precariat, you know, people working from home, you know, all of this sort of, that capitalism is or disorganizing us or organizing us in way that's much more difficult to organize in a traditional way. What about a political party? Now, again, what signs are there of that? I'll finish with this, Marcel. I was going through my books for whatever bloody reason, trying to look something up, and I came across maybe Stuart Hall, the New Times. And I was just reading through this book, New Times, and it said the age of mass political parties is over. And I was just thinking, oh, the DSA, not a political party, but a part of a bourgeois, but socialist, 160,000. Okay, tiny in America, a country of 350 million. But that to me represents possibility. If you take Britain, of course, it announced that the age of political parties is over. And then you have the Labour Party before the election of Corbyn, because he's on the ballot, and then the election of Corbyn, and then a massive membership. In Britain, again, I know they buggered it up, right? Your party. I mean, what was the number of people that signed up for it initially? Was it 80,000?
800.
800, see, I've forgotten already. 800,000 people, right? Okay, they to use an English word, they fucked it. But nonetheless, it's there, isn't it? You know, so in terms of discontent and in terms of perhaps where we should be looking for, looking to, is, I'm not rejecting trade unionism, I'm not rejecting co-ops or anything like that, but I am saying that I think there is the possibility precisely that strong trade unions can grow through a strong political party. And the raw material is sort of there. And I think the problem that we got, maybe, is us lot, the existing, and I include us in that problem. The left is unable to organize together for such a party that is necessary to get rid of capitalism. So yeah, I'm optimistic as well, because you do see these sudden spurts. There is clearly huge amount of dissatisfaction. There is clearly a need for a radical break.
Thank you. I have Anne. After that, I will bring Marcel back for reply, and after that, I have Jasmine, Mike, and Stan. If I missed you, please.
Sorry. Yes?
Yes.
I'm just checking what way I.
Yeah, but ask me, not him.
You're okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Yasmina. Okay, following on from Marcus and McShane, Ireland. Woo! International. Oh. So what I actually want to speak about is the perspective of the Second International in one of its resolutions. It could have been maybe 1911, the resolution on the unionization, organization of migrant workers. I think 1911, maybe even before then, 1907. Anyway, so basically, I know they never really actually did anything about it, but it was it's an excellent resolution based on the need to organize migrants coming to the United States and other European countries at the time, which there were quite a number of Chinese, I believe, going to the United States at the time, maybe Japanese, but there was this xenophobia, which was very strong among parts of the working class. And when we think about today and the level of right-wing ideas, anti-migrant ideas, we shouldn't think it's a new phenomenon, because it did very much exist then also. And anyway, the proposal was that, and also it was like slightly different insofar as there wasn't this refugee issue, was more migrants going and being organized by recruitment agencies to go to the United States, particularly the United States, to work. And the idea was that trade unions would get involved at the very beginning in the home country, organise them, making sure that they had safe passage, you know, that they didn't have to be so confined as they would if it was just left up to these employment agencies, and that when they'd arrive in New York, they would be greeted by the workers and they would become part of the organised working class. Now, it sounds really fantastic, and I think it's very possible, but it didn't happen because, as you know, over the next few years, the Second International began to slowly collapse. So I think that perspective is a very important perspective, both for left-wing political parties and for trade unions and for workers, militant workers in trade unions now. Instead, what we have, and in Ireland, we have an example of it, the majority of the left, they talk a lot about migrants from the point of view of refugees and asylum seekers. The trouble with that system is that it was set up to preclude people from coming because the fake asylum seekers are economic migrants who want to work. Of course, they want to work. They're leaving their homes, whatever reason they want to work. In Ireland, they're not allowed to work for the first 6 months, but they're never unionised. They're always outside the unions. The unions will not organise them. The one union in Ireland that does organise and began by organising Polish workers is called the Independent Workers' Union, which was begun by the Communist Party of Ireland. And now continues to organise, but it is very small and it's outside of the main trade union movements, the Irish trade union movement. But it does do that work, which is excellent work. And I think, well, okay, it might just be the kind of exemplary work that you need, but I still think it's important because I think it cuts across so much of the deserving and undeserving, and also cuts across the way in which the workers, the indigenous working class, are undermined by migrant labour. So I personally think, not that I'm in any position to do that, but I think it's an important piece of work that does connect with political organisations as well. Then the second point I wanted to make is the effect of the United States and its corporate exports. The fact that they so much of the time insist that there are no trade unions in their factories, and then they introduce this alternative, this kind of like worker company discussion forums. And in those factories, and now again, I can really only talk about Ireland, you cannot get unions off the ground unless you're very determined, and the union leadership will not take on those employers. Now, Ireland's probably a little bit special because we have the social partnership agreement where they work together, but nevertheless, I think most trade union leaders, as we've already spoken about, they're corporatists and they do not want to take on the employers. But I do think that the question of migrants being organised is especially important. You mentioned Uganda, and I was thinking at the same time about a less positive experience in Africa, and that's of COSATU, because there are millions of COSATU members taking part in these attacks on migrants. And there was this date, the 30th of June, they were all to go, you know, to Malawi, to Zimbabwe, they were to leave. And the trade union, the leadership of COSATU was saying, if you take part in this, we're going to kick you out of the union. Now, I don't know what the outcome was. I do know, of course, 30th of June has been and gone, and there have been attacks. But, you know, that was such a mighty union, wasn't it? That was such an inspiring union. It's so sad to see the situation as it is now. Of course, these things change again, but it also shows that we shouldn't just think about white people being xenophobic or racist, that it's happening everywhere when the pressure is on the workers. So, yeah, anyway, thank you very much.
Well, I have Marcel will reply and
Can you unmute? Yes, unmute.
Yeah, okay. As I said, I will solve all your problems. Well, Tina, I agree with you that the Soviet Union has been a major influence in this period between 1929 and 1974, let's say, and that often you see that social measures are introduced in capitalist countries with a reference to the communist threat. So I think that was a real thing, and I think that part of the counterattack from capital after 1990 has been made possible by the disappearance of the Soviet Union. Although, as you say, I'm not a fan of the Soviet Union, you are not a fan of the Soviet Union. I wrote a whole book about this, so read it. But that was clearly the case. There is a slight problem here for historians like me, and that is that if you want to prove the influence of the Soviet Union in the capitalist decision-making, you have few sources. It's very difficult to prove the direct influence of the fear of the Soviet Union in all kinds of decision-making, but I'm convinced that you're right. But now, I also agree with you that all these little attempts to organize the grassroots organizations that are emerging again and so on, that is not enough, and that we need really political organization of the working class. And this brings me to Jack's remarks, because the question is, of course, does this have to be, and you said also that you think that I'm thinking differently about this, Tina, than you, do we really need a political party in the traditional sense? And I agree with Stuart Hall that the classical mass political parties are over. You see this also, for instance, in the fact that there are more and more parties now without members. Berlusconi's party was the first one, perhaps, but for instance, the Wilders party in the Netherlands has also no members and so on. And the mobilization of people, thanks to the new media and so, is possible without ordinary membership. But that's not the main point. The main point is, and here I refer to the work of István Mészáros, the Hungarian philosopher who died a number of years ago, who says that the great catastrophe of the workers' movement was that in the 19th century there was a split between trade unions and parties, and that both wings of the labor movement were significantly weakened by this split. And he doesn't offer an alternative, but I think that the alternative is somehow that we try to reintegrate both organizational forms. That means that we also have to rethink how our political project looks like. And I'm sure you do not agree with me, but this is what I think is a major point here. We have to think about new ways of organizing people, also in the trade union aspect of it. For instance, I said already, collective bargaining is something which is losing influence worldwide. More and more collective bargaining is going down the drain. And more workers are not under collective agreements. You can show this statistically for many different countries. Still, they need also their interests to be taken into account. So, if you don't want to abolish trade unions, you need new methods of working. And for instance, what the Ugandan transport workers have tried is to do this, or the new trade union initiative in India, for instance. And there are many others who try to organize people without collective bargaining. And that is possible. That's not so. It's a kind of working which has been undervalued, especially in the advanced capitalist countries, but which we need to think more about and to learn more about from the successful experiments that have been undertaken in other parts of the world. And then the question is, how can you integrate political activities, political party activities, with the union activities? So that is the challenge. I have no answer, but I think that the only way forward is this. If we remain focused on a party, then we will never be successful. But maybe history will prove me wrong. The question of the breakaway unions is in this respect also important. I think we should reform the whole union movement drastically, and also the criticism of bureaucracy is very well here to the point. I think we should think of reorganizing the unions by democratizing them and then by integrating them somehow with political activities. To politicize the unions also. But not in the classical syndicalist sense, because as we know, that didn't work. And maybe it's not possible, but I think it can be done, but we have to think about it. And it would be good if the CU, for instance, would devote a few discussions on this in the future. I agree also with what was said about the concerted attack on trade unions that has certainly contributed to its decline, but that's also to do with the fact that the unions were not up to the times. They were bureaucratized, they had their own institutionalized patterns of behavior, of thinking of, and that has to do, of course, with bureaucratization also. And they were not organizing the people they thought were not so interesting. So migrant workers is a good example, but also precarious workers, all kinds of informal workers, and then of course people whose work was for a long time not considered to be work, like domestic workers. And now, thanks to their massive campaign and the fact that they were recognized by the ILO, now you see that domestic workers get more interest from trade unions as well. But they are, of course, very difficult to organize because they are so decentralized in their work sites. Sprouts of hope are around the world, but they are not as big as I think. And I just wanted to give you an inspiration, but I agree with you that maybe it's still more difficult than my presentation suggested. I have no glass, how do you call this? Glass ball?
Crystal ball.
Crystal ball, not glass, crystal. And there's also about the migration as a last point here. Second International had its conference in which it discussed migration in, I think, 1904. But that's not so important. So, but it was interesting to see in this discussion of the socialist parties that you had a strong divide between the receiving land countries and the sending countries. And the Europeans wanted to allow as much emigration as possible, but the United States and Australia and so on, they were not so interested in receiving so many people. So that was a bit, and especially Chinese they didn't like, and Japanese also. But that is a major problem for the labor movement, the attitude towards migration. I think myself that much of migration is not good. It's not good for the workers, because they have to leave their countries because the situation in the home country is not good. They have poverty and so on, so they try their luck somewhere else. It would be better if their situation in their own countries would be improved, so that they don't feel the need to migrate. Then still, migration should be possible, of course, but much of the migration now is based on misery. We have only to look at Ceuta now, and we see how true this is. And so we need a left answer to migration, and it struck me that there's nothing about in this university.
Latest weekly worker, we got an article making exactly that point.
Okay, I'll read it. Good. But yes, I think that is a very important aspect. And then the other thing is what Anne mentioned about the US influence on let's say the anti-union influence of the United States. It's very interesting. It's not just the United States just doing this. It's of course more countries, but the United States is especially strong in this field, and that is interesting because in the 1930s, yellow unions were prohibited in the United States. But then you see that after that, and some of them became ordinary unions, like the International Communication Workers Union, for instance. But there were many attempts then to revive the yellow unions in different forms, as you said, the workers' agreements, whatever, all kinds of names they have invented for that. And they are now exporting this pseudo-yellow unions across the world. And that is a very worrisome thing, which is not just the United States. It's really, I think, I wrote an article about this, long article, historical studies of industrial relations. So yes, but that is a major problem here also. And the problem will also be that if we start building new unions, that they should be, there will be suspicions that they are also kind of yellow unions. So it is very important to think about this from the beginning, that you avoid that danger. But okay, that's more or less now. So I've solved all your problems.
No problems. Thank you. First I have Mike.
Mike's going to cheer it.
Funny, no?
I'm going to read all this.
Those one notes. Mike.
The margin. Sorry, yeah. Mike, thanks Marcel for extremely interesting talk. The points I'm going to make are chiefly historical. You referred to the general theory of crisis, chiefly to German literature. Accessibility of this stuff in Russian, German literature, in English, is mostly via Richard B. Day's books. Yes. The Crisis and the Crash, and then I cannot remember the name of the one. Closer to the light, Mark. So, but the name, there's another one which is about stomach.
Face the crowd. People can see you speak.
Yeah.
They can see you. They have a screen.
Yeah. Okay. So yes. Beautiful. So it was just pointing to where, in terms of, because Marcel referred to the stuff in the German language, it's easier to access for the English speaking via Richard B. Day's books. Second, I agree with Tina and Marcus about the question of, and you've already said you agree about the question of responses to the Soviet Union. There is evidence about influence in a book by a man called John Quigley, Soviet Legal Innovation and the Law of the Western World, which looks at quite specific legal innovations where the Western states borrowed Soviet legislation. Related, Trotsky says in the transitional program, so this is sort of quite late 1938, trade unions never organized more than 25% of the working class, and at that the top layers. And that's basically correct. The reality, actually, your figures show increases. United States, it stays way down throughout the set of statistics. But in essence, what we've got is in the post-war, in the wartime, it's necessary to have trade unions organized on a very large scale. But also in the post-war period, that's retained. And we should think of it not as being that there was enormous strength of the workers' movement in the 1950s and 60s, but that trade union organization that was institutionalized, and closed shop institutions were agreed to very readily by employers. So we get institutionalized trade unionism, which then prepares the ground for the great attack on trade unionism in the 1980s, 90s. There's a sense in which one can make an analogy with the statized boroughs. The boroughs in the Middle Ages are originally fighting organizations of the bourgeoisie against the feudal lords. In the 12th, 13th century, boroughs are fighting organizations. You get statized. The state intervenes, the state takes over, except for Italy, where the boroughs emancipate themselves and become bourgeois states. And then in the Netherlands, in England, it's now people fight and literally physically drive out the officers of the boroughs in order to make revolutions. Migration. The Tory migration and asylum and so on. The Tories were campaigning against Huguenot refugees. The Tory party was campaigning against Huguenot refugees taking London workers' jobs in the 1680s. They were campaigning against French refugees infiltrating and undercover, bringing an alien culture in the 1790s. They were campaigning against Irish migrants, giving us the name hooligan in the 1800s. They were campaigning against Jews, the Jews fleeing, and are quite open, John Buchan and people like that, quite open about Jews are fleeing from persecution by the Russian state, but they shouldn't be coming here. In the 1900s. So it's there. Other side, which is, I suppose, more positive, fragmentary, small workplaces. One of the cases I worked on some years ago is the case of the journeyman tailors of Cambridge, who were prosecuted, successfully prosecuted in 1721 for conspiracy to raise wages, which established the offence of conspiracy to raise wages, and it got spread by the 1730s, conspiracy to refuse to work more than 16 hours a day to the great loss and damage of their employers as a criminal offence. And this background of criminal trade union organisation under criminal liability, of people in small workplaces and scattered groups. It's these guys in similar circumstances, the people who broke machines under the banner of Ned Ludd as a negotiating tactic. The people who sent Edward Thompson looked at people who sent blackmail letters. Blackmail was originally an offence committed as a form of industrial action. The people who burned out agricultural employers under the name of Captain Swing. That's where, or the Sheffield outrages and bombing. In that case, actually, it was small cooperative steelworkers bombing the merchant employer as a form of industrial action. That's what gives rise to capital conceding collective bargaining, because they'd rather see that than quote something worse. And that, in a sense, Marcel, you referred to new forms of organisation. Some of these things are very old forms of organisation revived. Again, in terms of organising precarious workers, in terms of organising migrant workers, it's going to involve willingness to accept illegality on the part of trade union organizations and party organizations and so on. That's it.
Thanks very much for a very good talk, Marcel. I'm sure you are aware there's a lot of debate about the translation from Russian of the term moribund. People are saying Lenin used something else and it's badly translated. But irrespective of that, there's a lot of debate on all of imperialism book, as you know. Now it's 1916. Some of the predictions are correct. We can see it's stagnation, parasitism, monopoly capitalism, they have all happened. My question is, are we saying that Lenin's definition of moribund was irrespective of time, it was a permanent definition for capitalism as it was developing then, or was it a diagnosis of that particular time, of that period within the First World War? One thing that a lot of people have said and written is that actually capitalism has shown a lot of adaptability. It has changed with time, it has reconstructed itself, and its opposite force, the working class, has failed to do so. And by failing to do so, it's the adaptability that basically has won. And I would like your comment. There is a lot of stuff. I keep getting articles about esoteric, exoteric Marx, so I've had to read about it. I didn't know anything about it, so I've had to read about it. I assume on secondary literature, you are not looking at Sweezy, Matic, and people like that. Sweezy has this argument that Marx had two different sides. One was political, one was economical. The theoretical political side was capital. And then for the larger audience, he was rebel rouser and saying the working class will win and so on. And that he's not saying it's a dishonesty. He's saying this is if you like, complementary to each other. But in times, they do contradict each other because the economical side does show more the strengths of capitalism as opposed to the political side, which shows the weaknesses and the fact that the working class has the possibility to win. So here, are we saying that in the absence of a formidable force to oppose capitalism, it still can survive? That's my question, basically. Your graphs on CPIM and PCF are very interesting, and especially CPIM is dramatic, therefore. But can't we say that, especially because you are in some ways, and I am very doubtful about the Soviet Union, coming from critique, I have to say that it actually stopped many struggles as well as supporting many of them. It certainly had a very destructive effect on worker struggles in what was then Third World, in Global South. It called on most of those workers to stop fighting, to support the governments in power. And therefore, it was a force against the working class in those countries. But couldn't we say, taking the Soviet Union out of it, can't we say that the CPIM and the PCF polls are more representative of their specific political strategies or geographic presence, CPIM in that particular area of India, but also PCF more importantly. And here, lastly, when we are looking at trade union movements and the fall of it, isn't it possible that we are conflating the crisis of a specific form of struggle as opposed to working class future, the future struggles? And here I specifically rely on your later slides, because your later slides contradicts that form, right? So, and again, it's partly the failure of Marxists to deal with the changing nature of work, with the changing nature of capitalism, that has managed to destroy. Why isn't there collective bargaining? There can't be collective bargaining because neoliberal capital has created hundreds of companies instead of one industry, right? Because the divisions in the working class have become so much that it's very difficult to organize in one union. So can't we say that it's our failure as opposed to, if you like, a historic trend? That's it.
I have four more people who indicated to speak. We have about 15 minutes, and I want Marcel to be able to reply. So try to keep it somewhat concise. First, have Stan.
Oh, yeah. You see. No, when I put my hand up to speak, I was thinking about the general crisis.
Look this direction.
I was thinking about the general crisis of capitalism, but that Lenin's good. Lenin's. Oh, I can see the camera there. Lenin's general crisis of capitalism was something that a theory of general crisis Marcel mentioned. Anyway, I'll come back to that. But we do have a problem, don't we? I mean, I can remember the optimistic days of the 60s and into the 70s, you know, when we thought that everyone was going to win, you know, that there was the three strands of struggle, you know, which was the socialist countries, the national liberation movements, and the working class in the advanced capitalist countries. And this was a tremendous combination that was obviously going to win. Soviet Union was on the way to communism, and there were added to it Chinese Revolution, wasn't it, 1949, Cuban Revolution in 1960. Then the Vietnamese were beating the United States, and South Africa was surrounded by losing Portuguese troops in the Portuguese colonies. Everything looked like it was all going to come out right, you know. So I can understand the pessimism today, that it doesn't feel the same, does it? Working class seemed to be strong at that time. So I think the fact, the illusion, you know, that the Soviet Union was a workers' state leading other workers' states on the way towards world socialism and world communism, that's been taken away, and naturally that leaves us in a situation of well, increased pessimism, if you like. It's quite understandable, but and I think, I mean, Jack mentioned the optimism of Corbyn's massive increase in Labour membership when he was becoming leader and when he was leader, and then Your Party, 800,000 people said, yes, we'll sign up. You know, they sent an email, actually. They didn't pay dues. It's different, I know. But it's a good beginning. It shows you that there's scope there to develop, you know. And when we overcome this clogged up left, which is still eating itself, you know, still splitting and dividing, when we overcome that culture of division, then everything will change. And it's quite possible to go forward. And I think, I mean, you have to remember a line from a Brecht song, don't we? Since we're doing culture this time, aren't we? It's just because we're human, we'd rather not lie down and starve to death, right? And, you know, in capitalism, which is still being reproduced, it ain't going to, by the way, yes, I mean, it's not going to fall on its own, you know that, is it? It's not going to collapse. The idea of collapse. I can remember in the time of the post-war boom, in the 50s and 60s, right? Everybody, you know, all the leading communists in the different socialist countries, as they called them, were saying the crisis, the general crisis of capitalism is deepening, right? Which they said right through the boom.
But I remember something, Jack. I remember we searched, or some of our comrades in the Leninist group before CPGB, before we made Provisional Central Committee, searched Lenin's collected works for the term "the general crisis of capitalism" and didn't find it. You probably remember. I didn't find it. Anyway, I looked it up because of that. I remember that. Couldn't find Lenin saying it anywhere, you know. So I looked it up today, just a little while ago. No, Vladimir Lenin, this is AI, right? No, Vladimir Lenin did not coin or explicitly use the exact phrase, "the general crisis of capitalism," in his primary writings. However, the concept, AI says, the concept is entirely rooted in his economic theories, blah, 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 and was officially formalized by Joseph Stalin and the Soviet state apparatus. So they say that he didn't say that he meant it. Lenin's formulation in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, was parasitic, decaying, moribund capitalism, and so on. The trouble is, it ain't going to go away on its own. And I think, I mean, Yasmin asked the question. I think it's a good question, you know. Well, it's not a question of whether it will collapse. It's a question of whether it's overthrown, isn't it? It doesn't matter how bad things get. You still have to do the work. Thank you.
Oh, were there not other people first who haven't spoken yet? I'm happy to.
Pat, do you know like
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, so first of all, Yasmin's point about the role of the Communist Party in breaking and stopping strikes. That was as a young teacher, that was my first experience in the trade union, that at my union meeting, it was the Communist Party members trying to stop the teachers going on strike. But that's, as far as I understand, is contradictory, that the Soviet Union had a dual role. Its existence did actually stop the worst excesses of capitalism internationally, but as Yasmin was saying, its role was also counter-revolutionary. So that's my first question. The second one is the sort of information in Britain. We have a new unions, so the cleaners, two main small cleaners unions. One is called the United Voices of the World, and it organizes the Spanish cleaners in these huge offices, and they've had very successful strikes. In my area, one of the big secondary schools, which is an academy, they are negotiating better deals. One of the problems is that they go in early in the morning, before the teachers come in. So it's been very difficult to coordinate support between the teachers and the cleaners. Thirdly, tomorrow night, I'm going to be speaking at I live in a London borough, in my local Trades Council meeting. At this meeting, we have Mel Mullings, the Royal Maritime Union organises transport workers and sailors, and they have a reputation of being a militant union. They were led by Bob Crow, a militant Communist Party member or ex-member, and have achieved a good wages and conditions for their railway workers, for instance. Okay, but on the question of the migrants being their members, who are migrants who are being deported by Britain, they've done nothing. There's other striking members. I'm going to speak on the persecution of the Palestinian movement using the IHRA. Oh yes, my last question is maybe a bit sidelined, but in Mike's book on revolutionary strategy, he's talking about the natural tendency for workers to organize collectively to resist the capitalist exploitation. And he's saying that in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Europe countries, this was not the case. So my question is, well, actually, the workers in the Soviet Union were repressed. So why was that the case there? Thank you.
Sure.
I think we just have to.
Yeah.
I
I
think
was
that's,
just going to ask about AI and neo-Luddism and what people are going to do about AI.
Well, okay. Well then, back to Marcel.
I think we're running a bit short of time, so it's fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Then, yes, okay. This really has become an interesting discussion. Mike, first of all, I agree with you that unions are often only meant for the upper layers of the working class, and that especially the precarious workers and the low-skilled workers are not let in, because the interests of the better situated workers are more on consolidation and permanent contracts and so on. They have and the temporary workers and so are then threatening their privileged position in a way. So that is a major contradiction which can be seen in many struggles. But now another thing, you mentioned the fragmentation of the workplaces in the older days, but I think that we see a new fragmentation of the workplaces today. Already in 2002 or so, there was a book by the ILO on trade union strategies and so, in which it was explained that already then more and more work became decentralized, that the large factories and where many hundreds of thousands of people are working together were disappearing, and that through outsourcing and the outsourcing of outsourcing, more and more we get smaller work sites. And this points to a very important aspect which is still much undervalued by the left, and that is the rise of commercial capitalism, commercial capital. We see a shift within the power relations within the capitalist class. Traditionally, the capitalist class, after it had gained the field, won the struggles, let's say, against the merchant capital, because merchant capital itself became industrial capital and productive capital and so on. But, after that, we see that we now can observe a return of merchant capital in powerful positions. And I mention three forms of it. First of all, we see a tremendous increase of the influence of firms like Amazon, IKEA, Walmart, and so on. So all these are firms that do not produce anything themselves, but they only distribute it. Classical commercial capital, buy cheaply, sell dearly. That's the first form of commercial capital. The second one is that you have more and more financial capital, which is also, in Marxian terms, is a form of commercial capital, of merchant capital, that has taken over the financialization of a large part of the economy. Is a major sign of that. And then, so there are more indications of this, but I'll leave it at this now. So, and we see that in the in the ruling class, you see a shift from productive and capital and mining capital, and so I could include in that, to commercial capital. And this has a tremendous influence on the trade union movement, because, and we have not studied this enough, the trade unions are traditionally strong in the productive sector. Now that the productive sector, here in Europe at least, is already weakened very much because of the movement to East Asia and so, and then it's also splintered by this decentralization, the trade unions lose power. This is one of the major sources of the weakening of the trade unions. And it means also that and because the financial sector and the commercial, the merchant sector are less well organized traditionally, and it is much more difficult also often to organize them. So this is a major structural reason why the labor movement is in crisis, I think. This is, yeah, okay, leave it at that. The word, or the difficulty of the word moribund in Russian, I agree with Yasamin about this, but I think that indeed now we are seeing a crisis of capitalism, which we cannot say it's the last phase of capitalism. Maybe it will revive as it did in the 1940s and 50s. So everything about that is premature. And that's also why I said it's a crisis, and a crisis can be result in a new revival. We have to be careful about this, but so there's also possible that the crisis of the labor movement can result in a new revival, and we work towards that, but it's very difficult, of course. Sweezy, I have to reread. The Soviet Union. Yes, I think the Soviet Union, in the balance, was a reactionary force for labor relations. Not only in the Soviet Union itself, but also internationally, although sometimes they also had a progressive influence, but that was maybe not for purely socialist reasons, but for other considerations. But there is this ambiguity, and that's also why capitalists in the West were afraid of it. Why should they be afraid if this was just only reactionary, what they did? Then we have, now we have increased pessimism. That's what Stan said. I agree, of course. But the only thing we can do now is think about possibilities for revival. And I heard already some suggestions here, but we need more discussion on this, much more, because the solution is not yet in sight, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcel. We'll be back at 3:30.